I never thought a muddy creek running through my backyard would become the battleground for the most absurd legal fight of my life. But here I was, standing in my kitchen staring at a cease and desist letter from the Pinewood Springs Homeowners Association. My name is Harrison Xander, and I bought my property in Bend, Oregon 3 years ago specifically because of that creek. The house itself was nice enough, a modest 3-bedroom ranch with good bones, but what sold me was the crystal clear water that babbled through the back 2 acres of my land. I spent countless evenings sitting on the rocks listening to the water flow, sometimes fishing for the native trout that made their way upstream. It was my sanctuary, my escape from the corporate grind of my software consulting job. The HOA had always been a minor nuisance. Monthly fees, the occasional complaint about my grass being half an inch too long, the usual suburban nonsense, but this letter was something else entirely. According to the document I was reading, signed by HOA President Patricia Donovan, the creek was actually community property, and I had been illegally restricting access to it for years. They were giving me 30 days to remove the natural rock formations and vegetation I had supposedly placed to block community members from enjoying their waterway. I read the letter 3 times, my coffee going cold in my hand. This had to be a joke. I owned the land. The creek ran through my property. I had the deed, the surveys, everything. I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the documents from when I purchased the house. Sure enough, the property lines clearly showed the creek running through my land, with my boundaries extending 20 feet beyond each bank. My phone rang. It was my neighbor, Frank Morrison, who lived 2 houses down. "Harrison, did you get the letter?" His voice sounded strained. "About the creek? Yeah, I'm looking at it now. This is insane, right? It gets worse. They're having an emergency HOA meeting tonight at 7. Patricia is pushing for immediate action. I heard from Margaret next door that they're planning to build a community walking path right through your property, along the creek." I felt my jaw tighten. They can't do that. It's my land. "You need to be at that meeting, man. She's got half the neighborhood convinced that you've been hoarding a community resource." I spent the rest of the afternoon digging through my property documents and researching riparian rights in Oregon. What I found was enlightening. As the landowner through whose property the creek flowed, I held riparian rights, which meant I had legal rights to the water and reasonable use of it. The HOA had absolutely no claim to it whatsoever. More importantly, Oregon law was very clear about water rights and property boundaries. The creek was mine, full stop. The community center was packed when I arrived that evening. I recognized most of the faces, neighbors I'd waved to over the years, people I'd made small talk with at the mailboxes. Now they were all staring at me like I'd committed some terrible crime. Patricia Donovan stood at the front of the room, a woman in her late 40s with that particular shade of blonde that came from a bottle and a hairstyle that probably required an engineering degree to maintain. She wore a cream-colored blazer and had papers spread across the table in front of her, like she was preparing to argue a Supreme Court case. "Everyone, please take your seats. We have important business to discuss." Her voice had that sugary sweet quality that immediately set my teeth on edge. I sat in the back row, my folder of documents on my lap. Patricia launched into her presentation with the enthusiasm of a televangelist. "As many of you know, we have been conducting a thorough review of our community amenities and resources. During this review, we discovered that a significant natural resource, namely Whispering Creek, has been essentially privatized by one of our residents." She pulled up a slide showing an aerial view of the neighborhood, with my property highlighted in red and the creek marked in blue. "This beautiful waterway should be accessible to all residents of Pinewood Springs. It was clearly intended by the original developers to be a community feature. However, Mr. Xander has taken it upon himself to treat this shared resource as his personal playground." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I felt my face getting hot. "That's not true," I called out, standing up. "The creek runs through my private property. I have the deed right here." Patricia's smile didn't waver. "Mr. Xander, please wait until the public comment period. We're following proper procedure here," she continued, explaining her grand vision for a community nature walk that would wind along the creek with benches and informational plaques about local wildlife. It actually sounded nice, except for the minor detail that she was planning to build it on my land without my permission. "We've already obtained quotes from 3 contractors," she said, clicking to another slide showing artistic renderings of a wooden boardwalk meandering through trees. "The cost will be approximately $70,000 to be funded through a special assessment of $300 per household." That got people's attention. Suddenly, the crowd wasn't quite as unified in their murmuring. "$300?" someone called out. "I thought HOA fees were supposed to cover improvements." Patricia's smile tightened. "This is a special project that will benefit the entire community and significantly increase all of our property values. Now, before we vote, I'd like to open the floor for comments." I was on my feet immediately. "I'd like to address this supposed community resource claim. The creek runs entirely through my property. I own the land on both sides of it. I have riparian rights under Oregon law, which means I have legal control over the water and the land it flows through. The HOA has no claim to it whatsoever." I held up my folder. "I have my property deed, the original survey, and documentation of my riparian rights. This whole proposal is based on a completely false premise." Patricia's expression shifted, a flash of irritation breaking through her composed facade. "Mr. Xander, the original neighborhood covenants clearly state that all natural features are to be preserved for community enjoyment." "Preserved, yes, but that doesn't transfer ownership. The creek is on my land. You can't just decide to build on someone else's property." "The community has rights too," a woman in the front row chimed in. I recognized her as Linda, Patricia's frequent sidekick. "You can't just keep a natural treasure to yourself." "I'm not keeping anything. It's my property. That's how property ownership works." The meeting devolved into chaos, with people shouting opinions from all sides. Some agreed with me, others seemed to think I was being selfish. Frank stood up and tried to make a point about respecting property rights, but he was drowned out by Linda's insistence that I was being unneighborly. Patricia finally called for order. "We will table the vote until next month's meeting. This will give Mr. Xander time to reconsider his position and perhaps consult with a lawyer about the community's rights. Meeting adjourned." I left the community center feeling like I'd been through a battle. My phone buzzed with a text from Frank. That went about as well as expected. "Coffee tomorrow?" Over the next week, things escalated quickly. I started receiving passive-aggressive notes in my mailbox about being a team player and considering what was best for the community. Someone left a pamphlet about sharing on my doorstep. Linda stopped her car in front of my house one morning while I was getting my mail and lectured me through her window about property values and community spirit for 10 minutes before I finally just walked away mid-sentence. But the real problem started on a Thursday morning. I was working from home, taking a video call with a client, when I heard machinery outside. I muted my mic and looked out the back window. My blood pressure spiked instantly. There was an excavator parked at the edge of my property, near the creek. 2 workers in hard hats were walking around with surveying equipment, and Patricia Donovan stood nearby with a clipboard, directing them. I ended my call abruptly and practically ran outside. "What the hell's going on here?" Patricia turned to me with that infuriating smile. "Good morning, Harrison. We're just doing some preliminary surveying for the Creek Walk project." "On my property, without my permission. The community has decided to move forward. We took a vote in an emergency session yesterday." "A vote about building on my private property? You can't vote away my property rights?" One of the workers, a guy with a gray beard and a weathered face, stepped closer. "Sir, we were hired by the HOA. If there's a property dispute, you need to work that out with them. We're just doing our job." "There's no dispute. This is my land. Check your permits." The worker looked uncomfortable and glanced at Patricia. "Madam, do we have the property owner's permission?" "The HOA has jurisdiction over all community improvements," Patricia said smoothly. "Mr. Xander is being difficult about this. But legally, we're within our rights." "That's a lie," I said flatly. "I'm telling you right now, you're trespassing. If you start any work on my property, I'll call the police and my lawyer." Patricia's smile finally cracked. "You're being incredibly selfish about this, Harrison. The entire community wants this project." "Then build it on community property, not mine. The creek is the focal point. It has to be on the creek. My creek, on my land." We stood there in a stalemate. The workers looked increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, the gray-bearded one cleared his throat. "Look, we're going to need to see some documentation before we proceed. If there's a legitimate ownership question, we can't move forward without clearing it up. We don't want to be liable for property damage." Patricia's face flushed. "Fine. We'll return with proper documentation. But this isn't over, Harrison. The community won't let you steal what belongs to everyone." "You can't steal what's already yours," I called after her as she stalked back to her car. I immediately called a real estate attorney named Robert Chen, who came highly recommended. His office was in downtown Bend, a sleek modern space that somehow managed to feel both professional and welcoming. "This is unusual," Robert said after I'd explained the situation and shown him all my documents. "HOAs can be overreaching, but usually they at least pretend to stay within legal boundaries. What you're describing is just straight-up trespassing and attempted theft of property rights." "So I'm right? They have no claim?" "None whatsoever. Your deed is clear, your riparian rights are well established, and Oregon law is very protective of those rights. The HOA has absolutely no authority to build on your land or claim any ownership of the creek. The neighborhood covenants they're citing don't override property deeds." I felt a wave of relief. "So what do I do?" "First, I'm going to send them a cease and desist letter that will make it very clear they're on dangerous legal ground. Second, if they persist, we'll file for an injunction. Third, if they actually attempt to build on your property, you can sue them for trespassing, property damage, and a host of other things. The HOA's insurance would probably drop them like a hot potato." "How much is this going to cost me?" Robert gave me a sympathetic look. "The letter is straightforward, maybe $500. If we have to go to court, it could run several thousand. But honestly, if they have any competent legal advice, they'll back down as soon as they get my letter. This is such a clear-cut case that no judge would even entertain their claims." We drafted the cease and desist that afternoon. Robert sent it via certified mail and email to Patricia and to the HOA's registered agent. I felt a small sense of victory, like I'd finally taken real action instead of just reacting. That weekend, I decided to do something I'd been putting off. I hired my own surveyor to come out and place clear boundary markers along my property line. If the HOA wanted to claim ignorance about where my property ended, I'd make it impossible for them to pretend. The surveyor, a quiet man named Tom Reynolds, spent half a Saturday carefully measuring and placing bright orange stakes every 20 feet along my boundaries. He even created a detailed map showing exactly where the creek entered and exited my property. "You've got a nice piece of land here," Tom said as he was packing up his equipment. "That's a good, healthy creek. Native trout?" "Yeah, I see them sometimes. It's why I bought the place." "Don't blame you. Word of advice, though, if your HOA is trying to make a claim on it, you might want to document everything. Take photos, video, keep records, just in case things get uglier." His words proved prophetic. The following Tuesday, I got home from a meeting with a client in Portland to find that someone had removed half of the survey stakes, just pulled them right out of the ground. The orange markers were nowhere to be seen. I called Tom, who agreed to come back out and replace them. "You should file a police report," he said. "Removing survey markers is actually a crime in Oregon." I drove to the Bend Police Department and filed a report with a detective named Sarah Klein. She was professional and thorough, taking down all the details, but I could tell she viewed this as a minor property dispute. "We'll include it in our records," she said. "But unless you have proof of who removed the markers, there's not much we can do. Keep your property documented, though. If this escalates, you'll want a paper trail." Everything went quiet for about a week. I started to hope that Robert's cease and desist had worked. Maybe Patricia had finally consulted with a real lawyer who explained just how badly she was screwing up. Then I got the bill. It arrived in my mailbox on a Monday afternoon, an official invoice from Pinewood Springs HOA. They were charging me $4,000 for obstruction of community improvement projects and legal fees associated with property rights clarification. I called Robert immediately. He actually laughed when I read him the bill. "They charged you for their legal fees to try to steal your property? That's bold. Don't pay it, obviously. Forward it to me. I'm going to add it to the documentation for our case." "Our case?" "Oh, we're definitely going to court now. They're not backing down, which means they're either delusional or they've got a lawyer who's as incompetent as they are. Either way, we need to get an injunction to prevent them from doing anything on your property while we sort this out legally. We filed for a temporary restraining order and injunction the next day. The court date was set for 3 weeks out, which felt like an eternity. In the meantime, I was supposed to document any further incursions or attempts to access my property. I didn't have to wait long. That Friday night, I heard voices outside around 9 p.m. I looked out my back window and saw flashlight beams moving around near the creek. I grabbed my phone, turned on the video recording, and went outside. There were 4 people on my property, all wearing reflective vests and carrying clipboards. Patricia was there, along with Linda and 2 men I recognized from the HOA board. They were walking along the creek bank, measuring things and taking notes. "What are you doing on my property?" I called out, making sure my phone's camera was capturing everything. Patricia turned, not even looking embarrassed. "We're conducting an environmental assessment for the Creek Walk project." "After dark? On my private property? After my lawyer sent you a cease and desist?" "The creek belongs to the community, Harrison. You can't keep us away from community property." "I absolutely can. You're trespassing. I'm recording this and I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," Linda chimed in. "We have every right to be here." I dialed 911 while keeping my camera trained on them. The dispatcher took my information and said officers were on the way. Patricia and her group didn't leave, just kept measuring and taking notes like they owned the place. 2 patrol officers arrived about 15 minutes later. I met them at my front door and explained the situation, showing them my property deed and the cease and desist letter Robert had sent. The officers went into the backyard and had a conversation with Patricia's group that I couldn't quite hear. After a few minutes, one of the officers, a tall woman with her hair in a tight bun, came back to talk to me. "Mr. Xander, they're claiming they have HOA authority to access the property for community purposes. Do you have documentation showing this is private property?" I handed her my deed and survey. She studied them for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, this is clear. Let me explain to them that they need to leave." I watched as she went back and had another conversation with Patricia. Even from a distance, I could see Patricia getting agitated, gesturing wildly. The officer remained calm, but firm. Finally, Patricia and her group trudged back across my property toward the street, shooting me angry glares the whole way. The officer came back to me. "They're claiming the HOA covenants give them access rights, but your property deed supersedes that. I've informed them that if they come back without your permission, they can be arrested for trespassing. I'd recommend you post no trespassing signs at your property line, just to make it crystal clear." "I will. Thank you. We'll include this in our report. If they come back, call us immediately. You might also want to consider getting cameras installed to document any further incidents." I thanked both officers and went back inside, my hands shaking with adrenaline. This had officially crossed the line from annoying to threatening. These people were so convinced they were right that they were willing to break the law. The next morning, I installed 3 security cameras covering the backyard and the areas along the creek. I also posted large no trespassing signs every 30 feet along my property line. If Patricia wanted to play games, I'd make sure I had evidence of every single violation. Robert was furious when I sent him the video footage. "This is perfect. This shows a clear pattern of harassment and willful trespassing even after being warned. The judge is going to have a field day with this." The court hearing arrived on a gray, drizzly morning typical of Oregon spring weather. The Deschutes County Courthouse was busy, and we had to wait almost an hour past our scheduled time. Patricia showed up with a lawyer, a nervous-looking young guy in a suit that seemed a size too big. His name was Kevin Hartley, and he couldn't have been more than a year out of law school. Judge Martha Rodriguez called us into her courtroom. She was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she had zero patience for nonsense. Robert presented our case first, laying out the property deed, the survey maps, the documentation of riparian rights, and the video evidence of trespassing. He was methodical and thorough, making it clear that this was a straightforward case of the HOA attempting to seize private property. Kevin Hartley stood up for his turn. and I almost felt sorry for him. He tried to argue that the HOA covenants gave the association authority over natural amenities within the community, and that the creek constituted such an amenity. He cited the original development plan from when the neighborhood was built in 1998, which mentioned preserving the natural beauty of the area. Judge Rodriguez listened patiently, then leaned forward. "Counselor, does your client dispute the property boundaries as established by the deed?" "No, Your Honor, but we maintain that the community has certain rights to— Does the HOA own the land on which the creek sits?" "Not technically, but the covenants. The covenants cannot override property law. Does the HOA have an easement specifically granting access to this property?" Kevin shuffled through his papers. "Not an explicit easement, but the community understanding has always been." "Community understanding is not a legal document, Counselor. Mr. Hartley, has your client received the cease and desist letter from Mr. Xander's attorney?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And has your client, despite that letter, continued to enter the property without permission?" Kevin looked miserable. There was an assessment that needed to be— "That's a yes. Mr. Hartley, I'm going to be very clear. Your client has no legal standing whatsoever. The property belongs to Mr. Xander. The creek runs through his property. He has riparian rights. The HOA has no authority to enter his property, to build on his property, or to make any claim to his property. Is this understood?" "Your Honor, the community has invested time and resources into planning to build on someone else's property without permission. That's not an investment. That's trespassing with premeditation." Judge Rodriguez picked up her gavel. "I'm granting the injunction. The Pinewood Springs HOA is hereby ordered to cease all attempts to access, build on, or make any claims to the property owned by Harrison Xander. This includes the creek running through his property. Furthermore, the HOA is ordered to pay Mr. Xander's legal fees in this matter. If the HOA violates this order, the board members will be held in contempt of court. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Yes?" Kevin mumbled. Patricia, sitting behind Kevin, looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. Her face was red, and she was gripping the arms of her chair so hard her knuckles were white. As we filed out of the courtroom, Robert couldn't stop grinning. "That was beautiful. Rodriguez doesn't mess around. Your HOA is going to think twice before pulling anything like this again." I felt relieved, exhausted, and vindicated all at once. So this is over? The legal part is. Whether Patricia Donovan accepts reality is another question. His skepticism was warranted. 3 days after the court order, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. Again, I threw on clothes and ran outside to find a construction crew already working on my property. They'd moved fast, clearly starting at dawn. An excavator was digging a trench along the creek bank, and workers were unloading lumber from a truck parked on my lawn. I was so angry I could barely speak. "Stop! What are you doing?" The foreman, a burly guy with a red face, waved me off. "We've got a work order from the HOA. Stand back, please, sir." "This is my property. There's a court order preventing this." "Take it up with whoever hired us. We're just contractors doing a job." I called Robert while simultaneously calling 911. Robert was apoplectic. "They're violating a court order? Patricia Donovan just bought herself a contempt charge. Get video of everything. The police should stop the work immediately." The police arrived quickly this time, 3 cars pulling up with lights flashing. The construction crew stopped working, looking confused and annoyed. The foreman showed the officers his work order, which had Patricia's signature on it. One of the officers, a sergeant named Mike Brennan, looked at the paperwork and then at me. "You have the court order?" I pulled it up on my phone and showed him the PDF. Sergeant Brennan read it carefully, his expression darkening. "This is dated 3 days ago. They knew they couldn't do this work." "So what happens now?" I asked. "We shut down the construction and inform the HOA board that they're in violation of a court order. That's a serious matter. They could face criminal charges." The sergeant had a lengthy conversation with the construction foreman, who grew increasingly agitated as he realized he'd been sent to do illegal work. "We were told all the permits and permissions were in place," he kept saying. "We wouldn't have taken the job otherwise." "You might want to talk to a lawyer about recovering your costs," Sergeant Brennan told him. "The HOA that hired you just put you in a very bad position." The construction crew packed up and left, but not before the excavator had torn up about 30 feet of my creek bank and crushed several native plants. My beautiful sanctuary looked like a war zone. I stood there staring at the damage, feeling sick. Robert filed an emergency motion that afternoon for the judge to hold Patricia in contempt. The hearing was scheduled for the next morning, which was remarkably fast, but Judge Rodriguez apparently wanted to deal with this immediately. This time, when we arrived at the courthouse, Patricia showed up without a lawyer. Kevin Hartley was nowhere to be seen. She sat in the gallery with her arms crossed, radiating defiance. Judge Rodriguez entered and got straight to business. "Ms. Donovan, you are here on a contempt charge for violating my order issued 3 days ago. Do you understand the seriousness of this?" Patricia stood up. "Your Honor, the community has rights. Mr. Xander cannot be allowed to—" "Ms. Donovan, I issued a clear order. Did you understand that order?" "Yes, but did you authorize construction work on Mr. Xander's property after that order was issued?" Patricia hesitated. "The project was already in motion. We had contracts." "That's a yes. Ms. Donovan, you willfully violated a court order. That is contempt of court. I could jail you for this." That got Patricia's attention. Her defiant expression cracked slightly. "Your Honor, I was acting in the best interests of the community." "You were acting illegally. The community's interests do not override property law or court orders. Ms. Donovan, I am fining you personally $5,000. If there are any further violations, I will add jail time. Additionally, the HOA will pay for all damages to Mr. Xander's property and his legal fees for this hearing. Is this understood?" "Your Honor, please." "Is this understood?" "Yes," Patricia said quietly. I thought that would finally be the end of it. The HOA sent a landscaping crew to repair the damage to my creek bank, which took 2 full days and looked decent when they finished. I received a check for Robert's legal fees. Patricia was quiet at the next HOA meeting, where I made a point of attending just to watch her have to acknowledge the court's ruling publicly. But Patricia Donovan was not the type to give up. 2 weeks later, Frank called me sounding worried. "Harrison, you need to see this. The HOA is circulating a petition to have you removed from the neighborhood." "They can't do that. I own my house." "They're claiming you're a danger to property values and community cohesion. Patricia's been going door to door getting signatures. She's telling people that if you don't leave voluntarily, the HOA will take legal action to force you out." I contacted Robert again. He'd handled so much of my case at this point that we were on a first-name basis, and he'd given me a discount for being the most entertaining client he'd had in years. "They're trying to force you out? On what grounds?" "I have no idea. Frank said something about property values and community cohesion." Robert sighed. "Let me look into the HOA bylaws and see what they think they're doing. But Harrison, I'm going to be honest with you. Even if we win this, which we will, is this neighborhood really where you want to live? You're going to be fighting Patricia Donovan until one of you moves or dies." He had a point. The constant stress was wearing on me. I wasn't sleeping well. I was anxious every time I heard a noise outside. This wasn't the peaceful retreat I'd bought the house for, but I'd be damned if I'd let Patricia Donovan chase me out of my own home. The petition effort fizzled after Robert sent yet another letter explaining that the HOA had no authority to force out a homeowner who wasn't violating any rules. Several neighbors who'd signed the petition called me to apologize, saying they'd been misled about what they were signing. It became clear that Patricia had lied to them, claiming I'd done something illegal or violated HOA covenants. At the next HOA meeting, there was a motion to recall Patricia as president. Frank nominated a retired teacher named George Williams, who'd lived in the neighborhood for 20 years and was widely respected. The vote wasn't even close. Patricia lost her position by a margin of 43-8. I'd hoped that would be the end of the drama. Patricia without official power was just another neighbor, right? Wrong. On a Sunday morning in June, I was enjoying coffee on my back patio when I noticed something odd about the creek. The water level was much lower than normal. In 3 years of living there, I'd never seen it that low, even during dry spells. I walked along the creek toward where it entered my property from the lot behind mine, which was community green space. That's when I saw it. Someone had built a dam. It wasn't sophisticated, just a pile of rocks, logs, and sandbags. but it was effectively diverting most of the creek's flow into a new channel that ran along the property line, completely bypassing the section that ran through my land. The once vibrant creek on my property was reduced to a trickle. I called the police and Robert simultaneously. This was beyond trespassing. This was environmental vandalism and interference with my riparian rights. Sergeant Brennan came out personally this time. He looked at the dam and shook his head. This is criminal mischief at minimum, possibly environmental crimes depending on what wildlife this affects. Do you have any idea who did it? I can guess. Security footage. The cameras don't reach back that far. It's on community property technically, but there's really only one person who would do this. We filed a police report, and I called the Oregon Water Resources Department. Messing with a natural waterway was serious business, and they sent an inspector out the next day. She was a stern woman named Dr. Rachel Foster, who took extensive notes and photographs. "This is illegal on multiple levels," she said. "You can't just dam up a creek without permits, environmental studies, and approval from multiple agencies. We're talking about federal and state regulations. Whoever did this is in a lot of trouble. Can you make them remove it?" "Oh, we'll do more than that. We'll be issuing fines and possibly criminal charges. Interfering with a waterway can carry penalties up to $10,000 and potential jail time." The Water Resources Department traced the dam construction through a receipt found near the site. Someone had purchased sandbags from a local hardware store 2 days prior. The store's security footage showed Patricia Donovan and Linda making the purchase. The police arrested Patricia on a Thursday afternoon. I heard about it from Frank, who'd witnessed 2 officers arriving at her house and leaving with her in handcuffs. She was charged with criminal mischief, trespassing, environmental violations, and interference with water rights. Linda was arrested the next day on similar charges. Robert called me with an update a week later. Patricia's lawyer's trying to work out a plea deal. The environmental charges are the serious ones. The state is not messing around with waterway violations, especially with the drought concerns Oregon has been dealing with. What kind of deal? Probably substantial fines, restitution, community service, and probation. She might avoid jail time if she's lucky, but her lawyer fees alone are going to bankrupt her. And get this, the HOA's insurance company has officially dropped coverage for any claims related to this situation. If anyone else wants to sue the HOA over this mess, the association is on its own. The new HOA board, led by George Williams, issued a formal apology to me at the next community meeting. They also voted to remove the dam immediately and restore the creek to its natural flow, hiring an environmental restoration company to ensure it was done properly. Patricia's house went up for sale in July. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd taken a plea deal. 5 years probation, $10,000 in fines, 500 hours of community service, and restitution for all damages and legal fees. She'd also been ordered to attend anger management classes. Linda moved out of the neighborhood entirely, apparently deciding that staying wasn't worth the shame. The environmental restoration company did beautiful work on the creek. They not only removed the dam but also repaired the erosion it had caused and replanted native vegetation along the banks. The creek looked better than it had when I'd first moved in. George stopped by one evening in August with a 6-pack of local beer. We sat on my patio listening to the creek burble past. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A lot of us knew Patricia was getting out of control, but we didn't want to rock the boat. We should have stood up to her earlier." "You stood up when it counted," I said. "That's what matters. For what it's worth, most of the neighborhood thinks you handled this with remarkable restraint. I would have lost my mind." "Oh, I lost my mind a few times, just not in public." He laughed. "The new board wants to make sure nothing like this happens again. We're reviewing all the HOA rules and bringing in a lawyer to make sure everything's actually legal and enforceable. No more Patricia-style interpretations of the covenants." That sounds like a good plan. Over the next few months, life in Pinewood Springs slowly returned to normal. The new HOA board was reasonable and focused on actual community issues like street maintenance and organizing neighborhood events. Nobody mentioned the creek anymore, except to compliment how nice it looked. I started to enjoy my property again. I spent evenings fishing, reading on the patio, and just listening to the water. Neighbors who'd been cold to me during the conflict started waving again, some even stopping to chat and apologize for believing Patricia's version of events. Frank and his wife invited me to a barbecue in September. It was the first social event I'd attended in the neighborhood since the whole mess started. People were friendly, asking about the creek and the wildlife I'd spotted. A couple of kids asked if they could see the creek sometime, and I said sure, as long as their parents came with them. "See," Frank said quietly, "you could have built that community access. People just wanted to enjoy the creek." "Sure, with permission and respect for property boundaries, not through theft and harassment." Fair point. Patricia's house sold in October to a young family from California. They seemed nice enough, and I made a point of introducing myself and explaining in broad strokes what had happened. I wanted them to hear it from me, rather than through gossip. "That's insane," the husband, Marcus, said. "We moved here to get away from that kind of neighborhood politics." "New HOA board is much better," I assured him. "George is a good guy." I ran into Patricia one last time, at a grocery store in Bend. We made eye contact across the produce section. She looked older, tired, her hair back to a natural gray instead of the aggressive blonde. For a moment I thought she might say something, but she just turned and walked away. I felt a strange mix of anger, pity, and relief. Robert and I had one final meeting in November to close out all the legal matters. The HOA had paid every penny they owed, the criminal cases were resolved, and all the injunctions and restraining orders had served their purpose. "This was quite a saga," Robert said, shaking my hand. "I've dealt with difficult HOAs before, but Patricia Donovan takes the cake. How are you doing with everything?" "Better. It still pisses me off when I think about it, but I'm trying to let it go. The creek is restored, the neighborhood is peaceful again, and I can actually enjoy my property. That's the best outcome you could hope for. You know, you could have sued Patricia personally for harassment, emotional distress, and about a dozen other things. The case would have been a slam dunk." I thought about it, but honestly, I just want to move on. She's already paying fines and restitution. Her reputation is destroyed. She lost her position of power. That's enough. "You're a better person than I am," Robert said with a grin. As winter settled over Central Oregon, I found myself reflecting on the whole bizarre experience. I'd bought a house with a creek because I wanted peace and solitude, and instead, I'd gotten a legal battle, criminal charges, and months of stress. But I'd also learned a lot about standing up for myself, about the importance of documentation and proper legal help, and about the dangers of giving petty tyrants unchecked authority. The creek itself was more beautiful than ever, flowing clear and strong through my property. I'd installed a small bench overlooking a particularly scenic bend, and I sat there on clear winter mornings with my coffee, watching ice form at the edges and listening to the water sing over the rocks. George stopped by one December afternoon to deliver a card signed by most of the neighborhood. It was a simple thank you, acknowledging that I'd stood up for property rights that protected everyone, not just myself. Several people had written personal notes apologizing for their initial reactions. "Patricia had a lot of people convinced that standing up for your rights was somehow selfish," George said. "But you showed us that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable." "I just wanted to keep my creek," I said. "And because you did, the HOA can't pull something like this on anyone else. You made the neighborhood better by holding the line." I hadn't thought of it that way, but he was right. By refusing to back down, I'd forced the HOA to confront its own overreach and reform. The new rules and oversight would protect future homeowners from Patricia-style power trips. On New Year's Eve, I hosted a small gathering at my house. Frank and his wife, George and his partner, and a few other neighbors came over. We built a fire in the backyard fire pit and listened to the creek as we counted down to midnight. "To property rights," Frank toasted, raising his glass. "To reasonable HOAs," George added. "To not being arrested for building illegal dams," someone else chimed in, and everyone laughed. I looked around at my neighbors, people who'd been strangers or even adversaries just months ago, now gathered peacefully on my property. The creek babbled in the background, flowing exactly as it should, through my land, under my stewardship, but shared with anyone I invited to enjoy it. "To knowing when to fight and when to share," I said, raising my own glass. As fireworks began popping in the distance, announcing the new year, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, truly at home. The battle for my creek had been exhausting, frustrating, and at times infuriating. But I'd won, not just legally, but morally. I'd protected what was mine, forced accountability on those who'd abused their authority, and come out the other side with my integrity intact and my property restored. Patricia Donovan had tried to take my creek through bluster, manipulation, and ultimately criminal action. She'd failed because the law was clear, my rights were documented, and I'd been willing to stand up for myself. Her legacy in Pinewood Springs was a cautionary tale about the dangers of HOA overreach and the consequences of confusing authority with ownership. My legacy, I hoped, would be that beautiful creek still flowing through my property, a reminder that sometimes the most peaceful outcomes require the willingness to fight for what's right. The water would keep flowing long after all of us were gone, following the same path it always had, through land I owned and protected, but ultimately belonging to itself. As the last of my guests left that night, Frank lingered by the door. "You know, when you first moved in, I thought you were just another tech guy who'd come to Oregon for the scenery and wouldn't get involved in the neighborhood. I was wrong. You're good people, Harrison." "Thanks, Frank. That means a lot." "Same time next year?" "Absolutely. You're always welcome to visit the creek." He grinned. "With permission and respect for property boundaries?" "Exactly." I closed the door and walked through my quiet house to the back windows, looking out at the creek reflecting moonlight. Somewhere out there, Patricia was probably bitter and angry, convinced she'd been wronged. Linda was probably starting over somewhere else, hopefully having learned something from the experience. Kevin Hartley was probably more careful about his clients. And I was here, in my home, with my creek, at peace. The whole ordeal had taught me that owning property comes with responsibilities, but also rights that are worth defending. It had taught me that HOAs need oversight and accountability, that small-minded people can cause big problems when given authority, and that the legal system, for all its flaws, generally works when you have clear documentation and good representation. Most importantly, it taught me that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, but simply living well, enjoying what's yours, and being generous with it on your own terms. I poured myself one last drink and went outside to my bench by the creek. The night was cold and clear, stars brilliant overhead, the sound of water constant and soothing. This was what I'd wanted when I bought the property. This moment, this peace, this connection to something natural and beautiful. Patricia Donovan had tried to take it from me, tried to claim that the community had more right to my land than I did. She'd been wrong, and the law had confirmed it. But more than that, she'd been wrong about what makes a community. A community isn't built by forcing people to surrender their property and rights. It's built by respecting boundaries, being reasonable, and finding ways to share and cooperate that don't involve theft and intimidation. The new HOA board understood that. My neighbors understood that. And maybe eventually Patricia would understand it too, though I doubted it. For now, though, it wasn't my problem. My problem, such as it was deciding whether to plant more native shrubs along the creek bank in the spring, and whether the trout population was healthy enough to support catch and release fishing. These were good problems to have. I finished my drink and headed inside, looking forward to sleeping soundly for the first time in months, knowing that my property was secure, my rights were protected, and my creek would still be there in the morning, flowing through my land, exactly as it should be. The battle for my creek was over. I'd won, not through aggression or manipulation, but through documentation, legal action, and the willingness to stand firm when I was right. The riparian rights that had seemed like an obscure legal concept when I first researched them had proven to be the bedrock of my victory. As I climbed into bed that night, I smiled, thinking about the irony. Patricia had been so convinced that she could simply declare the creek community property and make it so. She'd never bothered to research the actual law, never consulted with a competent attorney, never considered that property rights existed for a reason and were protected by centuries of legal precedent. Her arrogance had been her downfall. My diligence had been my salvation. And my creek, my beautiful creek with its clear water and native trout, would keep flowing through my property for as long as I owned it, a testament to the principle that in America, you can't just take what belongs to someone else, no matter how loudly you insist you have the right to do so. The HOA had claimed my creek was community property. They'd been wrong. I had the riparian rights, the property deed, and ultimately, the law on my side. And that had made all the difference.